We are ready. We are rolling. How are you
Awesome.
doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
How is your heart today?
How's my heart today? My good friend from college was just in town this morning with her daughter. They're on a college tour. And so I just had breakfast with her. And so I think my heart is in a warm place this morning. It's kind of nice. It's been a good
I
day.
like that. I like that. Laurie, you have become so famous. So I was at a friend's house yesterday and I told her about the interview and she was freaking out. She was like, "Oh my gosh, you're going to interview Laurie Santos." Like, I listen to her podcast every single week. You've become very, very popular. How are you handling it?
It's good. I mean, it's really humbling, right, to see the fact that sharing these strategies for improving happiness can really help people, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons I got into this, but it's so nice that it's actually working. So that part is humbling. I think a challenge of it is really there's so many more demands on my time, right? There's requests to give talks and podcasts and these things. And so I've had to be very careful about what I say yes to. And it's really a challenge to say no to things that are great, but to just say, I have to protect my bandwidth. I have to prevent burnout, and so that can be really tricky. But overall, it's just been an incredible experience.
So, before we delve into the science of happiness, let's go back to your childhood. Can you talk a little bit about where you grew up? What was childhood like? And what are some of the happy memories from your childhood?
Yeah, so I grew up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is a kind of, large working class town. It used to be the richest town in America when whaling and those kind of things were going on, but nowadays they don't really have whaling as an industry. So it's been a kind of struggling town when I was growing up. But I had, an incredibly happy family situation, at least for the kind of first, part of my life. I remember like we had a house that I would have a little yard that I could run around in and things. My brother is 4 years younger than me, and so he was a kind of constant playmate. And so I think that I had fun just kind of being a kid, being unscheduled, coming up with my own weird activities, whether that was like making up little games for me and my brother to play in the basement, to just kind of like creating and doing things. I feel like I wrote like lots of like fake books, and we had like this little kind of camera, so we would make little videos and things on it. And so I remember my childhood as being incredibly fun and incredibly creative.
What were those fake books about?
Well, I think they were kind of massively kind of taken from some of the cartoons I watched. One of them was called like The Cat and the Mouse, which I think was a basically plagiarized version of Tom and Jerry. I didn't never tried to publish it, so the plagiarism wasn't an issue. But it was kind of, drawing the pictures of the cat and the mouse and kind of coming up with these sort of fun stories and things. And so, yeah, so I kind of enjoyed doing all that stuff creatively.
So you just have one sibling?
Just one sibling, yeah, just my brother Aaron.
Very fast forward to today. You are a professor. Why did you want to become a professor? What led you to that path?
Yeah, well, I've always been interested in psychology and sort of how people work. And I think when growing up, I really just thought that, the way you were a psychologist is you were kind of a clinical psychologist, like you'd have to be a therapist or put people on a couch. But when I realized there was like this field where you could try to understand how the mind worked and how people thought, and that you could do research and publish, I was like, oh man, this sounds amazing. And I really only learned that, when I first started college. I had a great grad student mentor who kind of showed me the ropes, and even honestly explained that, like, and actually, many PhD programs, like, they don't even charge you. Like, you can go for free, you get your
Hmm.
education for free. And I was like, wait, this is amazing, And so it was kind of in that phase that I learned that being a professor was a possibility. What I really wanted to do was to find ways to study the mind. And I realized, like, oh, this is a career where you could do that.
From being a professor to being a professor of the most sought after class at Yale. Tell me about that journey.
Yeah, so I've been teaching at Yale for over 2 decades now, which makes me feel very, very old, honestly. The time goes by very fast. And for most of my time at Yale, I was, a professor at the front of the classroom. I taught classes about my research, which focused a lot on animals and what makes the human mind unique. And I thought college life was a lot like what college life was like when I was in college, which, was fine and mostly happy. There were some stresses, obviously, but it wasn't nearly as bad as the kind of thing we're seeing today. But I was kind of blind to really what young people are going through
Mhm.
today. And then I took a new role on campus where I became what's called the head of college. And so heads of colleges at Yale are faculty who live on campus with students. And so I lived on campus with students. I ate with them in the dining hall and kind of hung out with them. And that was when I really first started to see the college student mental health crisis up close and personal, where right now, nationally, not just at Yale, but nationally, more than 40% of college students report being too depressed to function most days. More than 60% say that they're overwhelmingly anxious. More than 1 in 10 has seriously considered suicide in the last year. I mean, it's like a really terrible crisis that our young people are going through. And that was when I realized the need for a class about strategies that all my students could use to feel better. I really wanted to teach them, okay, what does the evidence say about how you can behave in different ways, develop different mindsets, ones that will really make you feel better. And so that was how the class was born.
You know what's interesting about your class is you're looking at happiness through science, right? And when I think of happiness, in my conscious mind, happiness is a very visceral emotion and it comes when it comes, and I can't really control it because a lot of times our happiness hinges on external factors, right? Whether it's your relationships, career, and sometimes different types of happiness almost conflict with one another, right? So, happiness in career may conflict with happiness at home, your time spent with family. How do you teach balancing all those different aspects of happiness?
Yeah, well, I think, one of the ways the scientific approach can be really helpful is that it tries to just get people to notice what all those factors feel like, right? It tries to get you to notice, okay, what are some of the kinds of things that help you feel happy? And the way that people take a scientific approach is really just to ask people, hey, how are you feeling right now? On a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are you with your life? Let me give you this list of positive emotions. Have you felt those today? Right? So ultimately, it's a scientific approach, but it's a scientific approach that really takes into account people's subjective experience of
Mhm.
how things feel like in people's lives. So, kind of their emotions and things, and how they think their life is going. And it really just encourages people to maybe do little experiments to ask, like, okay, did you feel better in your life when you were hanging out with family or when you were at work or when you had a little bit of free time in your day versus when you were packed to the brim, right? And so you're kind of doing these experiments to just notice subjectively what feels good and what doesn't feel as good as I expected. And I think when you do that, you get some really interesting hints about how to balance all those competing factors. I think the first is that we often put our kind of like career achievements in the domain of happiness, right? We think like to be happy, I need to be successful or I need to be rich or I need to get this promotion at work. And when you start paying attention, when researchers get people to start paying attention, what they quickly realize is that those kind of career accomplishments don't really make us as happy as we think, especially money. It really doesn't make us as happy as we think. With the caveat that you have to have enough money to put food on the table and get by, right? If you're, living below the poverty line, that doesn't work. But, for at least many of the people listening right now, if you can put food on the table and keep a roof over your head, getting a lot more money doesn't really make you as happy as you think. That's what a lot of the data show. And so I think that, as you start to pay attention to this research shows, and again, the research is just you subjectively thinking about, okay, what really does matter when I pay attention? What you find is that the career stuff maybe needs to get kind of downplayed relative to the social connection stuff, the kind of true relationship stuff. Even when we think about what makes us happy at work, what we often find is it's not our achievements professionally, it's the relationships we develop at work. This new study that just came out in 2023, which took data from this big job website, Indeed, they found that one of the biggest predictors of your happiness at work isn't your salary or how good your manager is. It's really whether or not you have a best friend at work. So even at work,
Mm.
our social relationships seem to matter for feeling good. So, yeah, so I think we get some hints about how to kind of bring balance to all these different competing factors in our lives when we start to genuinely pay attention to what feels good.
You know what you think makes so much sense, but unfortunately, especially living in a capitalist society, I still see people are unable to make that conscious connection, right? And I can give you so many examples, even in our house, where my husband and I have had these arguments about what makes us happy. And he looks at happiness differently. And again, in the context of career, in the context of development, it may be immigrant mentality, but I think it is very um, common across the board. I wonder, how do we make that cognitive shift. How do we really teach our brains and almost reorient ourselves to saying, I can be happy if I am not extremely successful in career or if I am not making money beyond a certain threshold. It's okay. How long does it take? And what is the process of achieving that Zen mode?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really tough. And I think this is something that I definitely see in my students. We cover some of the studies, like literally showing that more money doesn't make you happy. I make my students read these studies. And at the end of every lecture where I talk about money and happiness, I'll have a big long line of students who want to well, that can't be true. Or maybe if you spend it differently and so on. And what's interesting is, yeah, we just have such a diverse range of students. You might think that that pushback would be from the students who were themselves really wealthy or grew up in a really privileged background. But the pushback I often get, interestingly, is from students who haven't had that sort of privileged background, or they're coming as a first gen student or from an immigrant background. I think for immigrants there really is this mentality of like push push push, pull your
Settling.
stuff out by your bootstraps, and maybe even like sacrifice part of your mental health to get that kind of typical capitalist success, right? So again, those are kind of anecdotal data of just which students I talk to, but yeah, I mean, I think these kinds of misperceptions are alive and well in the kind of immigrant mind. There's this idea that you kind of push for money, push for external success, push for accolades at work, and that will be the thing that brings you a sense of this sort of Zen peace. But when you look at the data, what you find is it just doesn't work that way. And so your question is really like, how do we overcome this, right? Like, how do we fight this bias? And I think it's really tough. Like, it's tricky myself. Like, I'll say, I know all the data about this stuff, but I still share these intuitions, right? Every time I say no to, a talk that was going to, give me a nice honorarium, I'm kind of like, oh gosh, I'm like saying no to money. What does that mean? Or,
What?
every time I turn down the opportunity to do something more at work, I know the research, but I kind of have this twinge of like, oh, am I going to regret this? Is this going to be the last opportunity I get? Right. So I completely get it. But I think something that's really helped to me is like knowing what the science says, right? Like I can look at the graph and be like, oh, I see.
Mm.
I'm not going to be that much happier if I double my income. Or I've read the studies showing of what's called the arrival fallacy, where we think I'll be happy when I get a promotion, or I'll be happy when I make this much money. And study after study shows that we just misperceive that. We just are wrong about we're just wrong in our predictions about what's really going to make us happy. And so for me, hearing the studies can be kind of helpful because you're like, okay, I know the research shows that I'm wrong. Like I can't change my kind of intuition that I have about this stuff, but I'm going to kind of not follow my intuition. I'm going to kind of follow what I think is right. And then often when you do that, you get new data to be like, oh, actually that, opportunity that I turned down so I'd have more time with my family, that was actually a good move, right? Like that actually did make me
Hmm.
happy. Or like that no I said in my calendar, that feels great when I kind of noticed like, oh, that was when I was supposed to take that trip or I was supposed to have that meeting. It's like, oh, this feels great to have a little bit more free time. And so I think when you start to see the outcomes of doing things a little differently, you can get your own data that like, hey, this is working better than I expected.
Laurie, you said something so interesting about looking at the data, looking at graphs. Are you ever concerned about over pathologizing the science of happiness?
In some ways, these are people who are saying, hey, at a scale of 1 to 10, this is how I feel about happiness and so on. That means it's kind of taking away some of the experience, right? If I had richer narrative reports, obviously we would learn more about, all the nuances of people's subjective experiences. But because like what the research is doing is really getting people's actual opinions of what's going on, I think it can actually be a powerful way to really understand how people are feeling. So yes, I'm a little bit less worried about the kind of pathologize it. I think it definitely is missing something about
How?
people's complete experiences, obviously, but it does let us get a kind of important glimpse that I think has been, at least for me, really helpful as I kind of puzzle through what's the right way to live a healthy and a happy life.
This is a great segue into bringing culture and cultural nuances into the idea of happiness. Now, I grew up in Pakistan, a collectivist society. Happiness is defined very differently there. It is less materialistic in some ways, right? So, spending time with your parents, with your grandparents, siblings, having extended relationships is, in a way, manifestation of happiness, right? And then you come to the US, and I felt very lonely in the beginning. I felt disoriented. Um, I recognized my depression and anxiety more in the US than in Pakistan because I was always surrounded by family and friends. Um, what differences have you seen across different cultures, especially Eastern versus Western cultures?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really great question. It's actually one we're starting to get, a better handle on, right? Where you're doing the right studies with big enough samples of people from different cultures. One of the best kind of research tools that we have to look at this comes from this report that's known as the World Happiness Report, where they survey all these things about people's emotion and happiness across all kinds of different countries. And what they find in the report is pretty interesting. First of all, there is great variance in happiness across cultures. It tends to often they sometimes do this thing with. I mean, they definitely do this thing. They do this thing with the World Happiness Report where they rank the different countries in terms of their happiness, which I think gets a lot of headlines, but misses a lot of the nuance. But when you do those rankings, you often find that Scandinavian countries kind of happiest. Norway, Denmark, those are the ones that are happy. But then countries that you might not expect, so countries in South America, places like Costa Rica and so on, tend to be a little bit happier and so on, at least relative to the US. And so often what you get from that is to say, okay, what are the happier countries doing a little bit differently?
Mm.
And what you find is they're prioritizing some of the same things you noticed, like, about your kind of home life back in the day, which is that like you're prioritizing things like social connection. Family is, kind of considered more valuable than work. You're going to when those two things come into conflict, family is always going to win out, right? People are around other people more often, so there's much less loneliness, much more social connection. And there's cultures that tend to be happier, tend to be a little bit more on the collective side, right? You think of Scandinavian countries and they have things like universal income and like allowing to kind of help other people, right? It's not kind of like you live and die by your own sort of heart
It
alone,
takes
right?
a village kind
Yes,
of approach,
exactly.
right?
Exactly. And so I think when we start looking at those cultural differences, one thing we can say is like, hang on, maybe the values that we have in the US, this kind of super individualism and capitalism at all costs, maybe we're kind of missing something that really does matter for our actual happiness. And so I think these kinds of like comparisons across countries can be really powerful. I think another thing we see in these comparisons across countries is that it's not all about the individual happiness. Like what's happening politically obviously matters a lot.
Yeah.
So the equality of a country seems to matter a lot. The trust that people have in government matters a lot. That's actually one of the reasons in the United States that we've dropped a lot in our rankings of happiness, is because there's less and less trust in the political process, trust of our fellow man with all the political polarization we see in the country. And so I think also these kind of cultural comparisons make us realize, hang on, a lot of the strategies are about, well, hey, you change your personal behaviors and your personal mindsets, but also we need to think about the structural issues that people face and the political issues that people face if we really want everyone to be as happy as they can be.
I want to circle back to young folks. You teach them, and you understand a lot of issues around happiness that they're facing. And what I've noticed is, I mean, there's so much to talk about when we think about Gen Zers. They see one in terms of their politics, right? They are looking more and more towards their friends as being politically aligned with them, morally aligned with them, right? A measure of how they choose friendships. How do you think that redefines happiness for them? And also, how does social media play into all of this? They think they are not lonely because they are on social media and they're scrolling, but then they're basically doom scrolling, right? It's like enragement is equal to engagement kind of deal. Who's listening to this podcast right now?
Yeah, so I'll take the second one first. This idea of, how is social media and our technology in general, honestly, kind of affecting our happiness? One of the biggest predictors of people's happiness is our sense of social connection, our sense of true social ties, having people that you can count on, that you really care about, and just being around other people in real life. In theory, social media and our technology, our phones in general, we're supposed to help with that, right? We're supposed to be able to, even be more socially connected. That's why it's called social media. But I think by and large, what these tools are doing is more disconnecting people, at least in real life, or especially in real time. It turns out you don't necessarily need to connect in real life to get the kind of social connection, nutrition that kind of comes with being with other people, but you need to do it in real time. You and I are right now talking, we're not in the same room, in the same studio, we're talking across the podcast software. And research shows that's pretty good, right? Because you can see each other's facial
Mm.
expressions, we're kind of talking in real time. Doesn't work as much if you're just like texting or posting, a comment on someone's Instagram feed, or, scrolling through TikTok videos or something. That's not as nutritious in terms of our psychology of what we need for social connection. And so I think that one of the biggest hits that people get from social media is that it's just an opportunity cost on hanging out with each other in real life. How often have you seen a group of young people, or honestly a group of adults for that matter, like sitting around a dinner table and everybody's got they're with each other in real life, but they're not connecting in real life because they're looking at their phones, right? And so I think that's a big hit. I think social media is also a big hit, we know, for young people, just in terms of their sleep. Making sure you're getting the appropriate amount of good sleep is super important for our mental health. And these days, what you find is many young people claim not to be sleeping as much because, like, they're on their phones and they're staying up late at night watching TikTok videos and other kind of screen time things. So I think there's lots of reasons our social media is hurting happiness generally, and that hit on happiness is especially bad for young people. But I think the loneliness hit that young people are going through kind of gets to your first question about kind of, what's happening with young people kind of feeling like it's, harder to kind of connect with people across the political divide. I think that's a generation that's heading the most hit of the political polarization we're experiencing. And I think that winds up being really tricky because it means that we're not kind of getting the usual social connection we get. I think that people feel really limited in the number of friends they can
Mm.
make and who understands them and so on. And I think that just contributes to the loneliness crisis that we're seeing among young people today.
You've talked about third spaces for younger people. How important are those, and whose responsibility is it to build the government, societies, individuals?
Yeah. So third spaces is a term that political scientists and sociologists use to talk about places that are not your home and not your work if you're an adult, that you can be around people and hang out with one another a lot, right? So I think of, in my youth, there were third spaces like the mall. In the 90s, you just go to the mall and people would be at the mall and everyone would see each other. It wasn't work, it wasn't, home or school, but it was like a place that I could go that I knew I would run into people that I knew who were my age and similar, like-minded things. I think even when I grew up in the 90s, there were less third places than there were in the heyday of third places, which was kind of in the 1950s and 60s, where you had lots of churches and Lions clubs and barber shops and just places where people got together all the time. And the joke is from that 90s TV show Cheers, of like, the place where everybody knows your name, right? That's kind of what you're going for with a good third place. And the evidence really suggests that third places have been going away from the 1950s to now. If you just plot the number of, churches or bowling leagues or barber shops, right,
Mm.
those things have gone down over time, to the point that our young people say, one of the reasons I don't get together with other people is like, I have nowhere to go, right? We have to go somewhere where you spend money, right? Like, it's kind of, there's not these kind of free places you can go to just be around other people as often right now. And I think that, the evidence really suggests that that's a bummer. It's a bummer for our loneliness. It's a bummer for our ability to like connect across different kinds of people, right? If you're going to your church, your barbershop, you're likely to see somebody who like maybe has a different background than you, or maybe a different political belief than you, and so on. And I think we just get that less and less often because we have less third places to kind of connect in these, kind of comfortable, leisurely ways where we're not really talking about politics, but it kind of comes up in this sort of subtle way. And so without those third places, I think we're becoming more lonely, more politically polarized, and so on. In terms of who should fix that, I think everybody should fix it. I think there's a role that we have as individuals to create these spaces. And I think we can do more than we often expect. I have a friend here where I live in Massachusetts who a while ago now, it's kind of 2 decades running, started this thing that he calls Monday Movie Night. And every Monday movie night, like, he just invites a bunch of people to come over and watch movies, and people make a kind of collective, kind of healthy meal, like a big chili or something, and everybody gets together. And it's really been so nice to be part of this, because it's just like, every Monday, I know there'll be people there, and you can kind of connect with these kind of interesting folks who are doing stuff. And so I think there's a way that we as individuals can set up our own
Mm.
third places and really kind of put time into doing that, making these spaces. But there's also lots of sociological research suggesting the power of governments being really involved in creating third places, right? And just organizations kind of doing that. Many of the most famous third places aren't ones that are necessarily created by an individual for like, a social group around their neighborhood, but by institutions, so things like
Mm.
the Lions Club or the NAACP, or, by like the kind of communal barbershop or something like that. And so I think it would actually be great for governments to start thinking about how they can develop more of these third places.
That's a great point. Laurie, I want to talk a little bit about your own relationship with happiness, right? You've talked about how people should find happiness in little things. Do you seek happiness, or does happiness come to you through activities that you're just generally doing? Like, is there a conscious mind seeking happiness um, within those activities, or it just comes organically to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in some ways a little bit of both. And so, we definitely know from the research that there are just certain behaviors that kind of make us feel happier. So engaging with other people, we've talked about a little bit, doing nice acts for other people, acts of kindness, acts of pro-sociality, like really kind of help people feel better. If I've been having a rough week, one thing that I often do is to say, okay, how can I get a little bit more social connection in? Like, which friend do I need to call this week? Who do I need to
Hmm.
see to kind of get that social connection in? And so in some ways it's both organic to certain activities that we engage in, that they feel good and boost our positive emotion and increase our satisfaction with life. But if we're not getting those kind of behaviors in naturally, we can really intentionally decide, hey, I'm going to do this more often. And the consequence usually is a boosted sense of well-being.
So, recently, what is one thing that made you happy?
I just had this lovely breakfast with this friend of mine from college, and I had a really good like bagel sandwich. And I took a moment to like savor, like, this is great. Like, the bagel's really crunchy. Like, and just the act of that, paying attention, being a little bit more mindful and present, it can kind of boost your positive emotion and make you experience things like gratitude, this sort of thankfulness for having this interesting experience. And that's just a sort of small retuning of our attention to pay attention to stuff that feels nice, and then all of a sudden you start feeling better.
Do you differentiate between being content and being happy? And is happiness really a need, or is it a want?
When I think of happiness, I think of it as kind of being like almost like happiness with a capital H. It's kind of equivalent to sort of living a good life, living a happy life. And it has these kind of two components. One is sort of an emotional component where it's kind of how you feel in your life. And the second part is sort of a like thinking component, like how you think your life is going. If you kind of feel good in your life and think your life is going well, you're living a happy life.
Mm.
That this term is sort of this kind of big capital H term, happiness, is often equivalent to what like the old ancients like Aristotle thought about when they thought about things like eudaimonia, this like idea of a good life generally, right? So that's kind of what I think about when I use the term happiness. When I think of something like contentment, I almost see that as like one of the positive emotions that makes up happiness. Contentment is just the sense that you're kind of at peace in life. It's a kind of like low arousal but really high positive state. Like joy or surprise or sort of laughter might be a kind of high arousal, high positive state. Whereas contentment's like low arousal, you're just chilling and everything's fine, but things feel good when you sort of reflect on how they feel. And so the way I think of the connection between the two is contentment is an important, but one of many important emotions that you want to get
Mm.
in to sort of have a happy life, to have eudaimonia or a good life.
I wonder if other emotions like grief and loss inform people's happiness differently. People who've experienced, say, grief or loss look at happiness differently than people who haven't. Have you seen
Yeah.
that in your studies?
Definitely. There's a lot of work on a topic that researchers call post-traumatic growth. So many of us have heard this term post-traumatic stress. You go through some terrible, stressful period, and you have these consequences, high arousal, high anxiety, and things later on. But post-traumatic growth are cases where you go through something terrible, you go through loss, and you go through grief. But on the other side, you experience like a sense of growth, right? Like, it's not something that you choose and it sucked and it's like worth recognizing the bad part of it. But like on the other side, people self-report feeling a deeper sense of connection, a deeper sense of
Mm.
spirituality, what is meaningful in life, your deeper sense of purpose, and kind of a deeper sense that you can sort of go through things. I think this term resilience, as I know you've talked about on your podcast, is a
Yeah.
really complicated one. But people who've gone through to the other side often say, I know what I'm capable of now. Again, I wouldn't have
Mm.
chosen that. It's awful,
Mhm.
but like I feel like I've grown and I'm stronger on the other side. And I think this gets to a misconception that we have about positive emotions. I think one big misconception I see when people come to my work in happiness is they kind of embrace this sort of toxic positivity approach that a good life, this happy life, is positive emotion all the time. But
Yeah.
but when you look at the science, what you find is like that's not true. A good life involves some anxiety, it involves some loss, it involves some grief, it involves some frustration, some justified anger, right? The way you get to a good life is to not just have these negative emotions, but really learn from them and push through them to see like how they're teachers. And so I think this is another misconception we have, just like, oh, money and successes matters for happiness. I think people think a happy life has none of the bad stuff, but a happy life includes the bad stuff. The bad stuff is really important for getting us to kind of grow and become, the people we really want to become someday.
You're absolutely right. And do you think paying attention to the present also matters? Because a lot of times we look at the past and then we look at the future. So, what I did yesterday, I had an argument with my husband. I went to bed a little angry. I woke up in the morning. I wasn't thinking about it, but it was part of my subconscious
Mm-hmm.
self. And then my husband and I talked, and we were like, okay, now we're fine. And it changed my mood, but I was still thinking about
Mm-hmm.
yesterday. How do I start thinking about today?
Yeah, well, it takes some work, right? I mean, I think we have brains that are just built to kind of mind wander, to kind of think about the past, think about the future. We're anywhere but the present. But there are techniques and you can use to get better about being more present. One is a technique that's just called savoring, which is just what it sounds like. That was kind of what I was doing with my bagel this morning, which is like, what does this taste like? What does this feel like? How would I describe this? You just like force yourself to
Ah,
become curious about whatever is going on in the moment. And interestingly, that includes when things are bad. One way that we can get through bad emotions like grief or anxiety is to really pay attention. Like, okay, how does this feel like? My chest is heavy. Like, my face
hmm.
feels tight, right? Like, I feel like I have, a pressure like pushing on me, right? When you really kind of get to know and be present with those negative emotions, they can actually help you feel better. Um,
So being
but
super aware of negative emotions or positive emotions for that matter.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think we just kind of don't notice our experience, right? Kind of, and that means we don't really get to learn from it or get to really feel it. In some ways, that's really kind of sad, right? That we're sort of fast forwarding our life or rewinding our life and never kind of just playing it right there. So I think, yeah, so savoring and just kind of being part of the present moment is powerful. But then a second technique we know works from the researchers, so many spiritual techniques for kind of being a little bit more present. So practices like meditation or prayer, all these practices where you really kind of pay attention, to a particular mantra or, a particular set of
Hmm.
words and so on. Like those rituals, the research shows can really build up your presence over time, particularly practices like meditation, where the practice is really all about intentionally noticing the present moment without judgment. Those kinds of practices over time, like literally change your brain. You literally change the amount of gray matter in your brain, even if you just start meditating as a novice, right? And so I think those kinds of like, it's almost like kind of something like going to the gym for your mind. If you do bicep curls to like, make your arms stronger, doing meditation is kind of a way to make your presence stronger over time.
I'm glad you mentioned spirituality. When I'm feeling low or when I'm feeling anxious, I do pray and it calms me down. And your research, how much have you seen people's backlash against spirituality or accepting it in a way? Do
Mm-hmm.
you see those conflicting ideas?
Yeah, well, there's actually lots of research, studying kind of happiness in people of different religious faiths and religious backgrounds. And one of the clear patterns suggests that religious individuals tend to be happier. It
Mhm.
seems like that happiness, though, comes a lot from religious practices. So
Yeah,
it comes from the not the belief part, but the prayer part.
the
It comes from
rituals.
the rituals, exactly, going to services, right? Taking time off, whether it's a Sabbath or whatever, right? And what's interesting is it kind of doesn't matter which religion it is. You see boosts of happiness in people of Muslim faith or Buddhist faith or Catholic or Jewish faith all over the board. It kind of doesn't matter what rituals you're doing. It's just that you have rituals that give you a sense of connection to something bigger than you that seem to matter.
Hmm.
And so, I think as we, become a more secular society, at least especially here in the US, in some ways we do that at our peril, right? We're missing out on a real path to happiness. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to become religious, but it means that if you're not getting your sense of purpose and connection from
Mm,
religious faith, you might, in those rituals, you might need to find other rituals and other
right.
ways to get a sense of purpose.
What are some of the other rituals that you've seen people follow to replace religion?
Yeah, there's a great kind of religious scholar, Casper ter Kuile. He also has a fabulous podcast who's actually been doing work on these kind of other traditions that look a lot like faith traditions. For example, he writes a lot about CrossFit, which sounds kind of funny, but it's like, people go every week and it becomes a third place and it becomes something that, you have a whole set of values and meaning. It becomes a spot where people wind up doing things for each other. He talks about these cases of, somebody in your CrossFit group gets sick and everybody rallies and, makes
Oh,
food for them and
wow.
things like that. And so what he finds is that you can sometimes get these other organizations that work a lot like faith traditions that have a lot of the same, obviously not all of the same benefits, but some of
That's
the
so
same benefits.
fascinating.
So I
That's
think,
so
as
fascinating.
human,
On a scale of 0 to 10, how happy are you in your life and why?
well, I'm usually around like a 7 or 8. And I think I wasn't that way before. I think I'm at a 7 or an 8 in part because I do engage in all these practices a lot. My instinct is not to engage in as much social connection. I'm really not a present person. I'm much more ruminative and stuff like, but I think as I've studied this more and more, I've recognized how important it is to act this stuff. Like happiness is possible, but it takes work. It's just like having a fit body, right? Like, like it's possible to eat healthy and go to the gym all the time and move your body, but you got to put some work in. And I think happiness works. My analogy is that happiness works just like that. Like you can do it, but it takes kind of constant work and constant practice. And that's the thing I think too, is that it's just like my colleague Nick Epley is fond of saying that happiness is like a leaky tire. It's like you were happy, but then it kind of goes down and you have to do something to pump it up. And so remembering that your mental health is something that takes kind of constant work has been helpful for me because it's really allowed me to put that work in. And the act of doing that has made me happier. So I'd say, yeah, I'm like a 7.5, 8 out of on a 10-point happiness scale.
Moving to the end, Laurie, if you were to describe the United States of America in the context of happiness, how would you do that?
Yeah, I think I would describe it, unfortunately, as going down right now. And that's really what these recent data from the World Happiness Report show, is that overall happiness in the United States has been going down. We've dropped out of the top 20 in the world for the first time ever since the World Happiness Report has started. And sadly, a lot of that increased unhappiness is because of young people, is because young people are feeling so depressed and so
Mm.
anxious. And so I think the way I would describe it is the United States isn't doing very well, but in that challenge, we really have an opportunity, right? This is a real opportunity we have to kind of follow what the science shows in our behaviors and our mindsets to feel happier.
Laurie, thank you so much for coming on Immigrantly. As I said, you are a superstar. A lot of people love you, and I am so glad that you're doing what you're doing because we all need the Happiness Lab podcast in our lives to feel
Thank you.
happier. But thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Such a great time. Thanks so much for having me on the show.